Apanho sabonete, pego uma canção e vou cantando sorridente. Duchas corona, banho de alegria num mundo de água quente. Apanho sabonete.
Everyone has their own way of trying to make sense of the world. Some people say, yeah, we should always try to see the good side of everything, even when everything seems to be falling apart.
Mom, another plane just crashed into the other World Trade Center. Another plane hit it. A jumbo jet. I'm so scared. I'm leaving. Oh, no, don't.
Others believe the world has always been dark. We were just too busy or distracted to notice. And maybe they're both right. But maybe some things just don't have a good side. For a lot of kids growing up in Brazil, moments like this, running barefoot in the street, kicking around a ball until the sunset, those are the memories they hold on to forever. The sound of laughter, dust in the air, someone yelling, "Last goal wins!" But not every childhood gets to become a memory. In some corners of the world, joy disappears fast. Between the late 1980s and early 2000s, something started happening in Brazil. Something strange and terrifying. All across the country, especially in places that had been ignored by the government for years, where poverty was deep, where public services barely existed, young boys started disappearing. Most of them were between 8 and 14 years old. Some vanished without a trace. Others were later found, their bodies mutilated in ways that left entire communities shaken. And when the press got hold of it, a single word started showing up again and again: rituals. You might remember the Evandro case, which I've covered previously on this channel. Evandro Ramos Caetano was 6 years old when he disappeared in Guaratuba, in the south of Brazil, in April 1992. His body was later found mutilated, and his death quickly became linked to theories of black magic, satanic rituals, and secret societies operating in the shadows of a small town. That video got hundreds of comments. So many of you shared your thoughts, theories, questions, and for good reason. Because what happened to Evandro, it wasn't an isolated case. Around that same time, 28 other children had also gone missing in the region. Really, just think about that. 28. And most of those cases remained unsolved for years. Some bodies were never found, and others were only identified much later, like Leandro Bossi, who disappeared in the exact same town as Evandro. He was just 7. Back then, in the 90s, people thought his disappearance was connected too, but no one could prove anything. His remains weren't identified until 2022, through DNA. That's how long his family waited for answers. That's absolutely insane. Now, during that investigation, another name came up. Someone who would go on to be linked to even more disturbing cases across the country. Valentina de Andrade. Valentina wasn't just some local figure. She was actually the founder and so-called spiritual leader of a group called Lineamento Universal Superior, or LUS. And she wasn't running it alone. Her husband helped lead the group too. Their beliefs? A mix of esoteric philosophy, anti-religious views, and alien messages. Literally, they claimed that children were unconscious instruments of spiritual energy, and according to them, those children were dangerous to the balance of the universe. So when Leandro's case was being investigated, police started hearing about this group. Some of the suspects being questioned mentioned LUS by name. And it didn't take long before the group's teachings, especially their rejection of Catholicism and obsession with spiritual power, started worrying the authorities. In July 1992, Revista Veja, one of the country's biggest magazines, ran a story saying that confessions from suspects had mentioned the sect, and that those beliefs, particularly about children, were being taken seriously by investigators. There are rumors that LUS members had been in a local hotel where Leandro's mother worked at the time. Now, even with all that suspicion, Valentina was never officially charged in the Guaratuba case. But that wouldn't be the last time her name showed up, because while the focus was on southern Brazil, another horror story was unfolding hundreds of miles away in the north, deep in the Amazon, in a city called Altamira, where dozens of boys had also disappeared, where fear of ritual crimes was spreading fast, and where this whole mystery was about to take a much darker turn. So while people in the south of Brazil were still processing the tragedies, Altamira had already been living its own nightmare. A place far removed from Guaratuba in distance, but not in horror. Now, back in the early 90s, Altamira was a city in transition. It sat between forest and river, right on the edge of the Xingu, a remote spot deep in the state of Pará. It was growing fast, but it hadn't caught up to itself. There was barely any infrastructure. Electricity was unreliable, clean water was a privilege, and most people lived in wooden houses thrown together with whatever materials they could find. In the poorer parts of the city, kids made their own fun. On street corners, in the dust, chasing after footballs, picking mangoes from the trees. And yeah, that's where it started, where the first boys began to disappear. Between 1989 and 1993, a pattern began to emerge. It was subtle at first, just a few cases of boys who had either gone missing or come forward with stories of violence. And most of them were between 8 and 14 years old. They came from poor or rural families. Some were indigenous, some mixed race. Many of them worked small jobs, selling sweets in the street, running errands, anything to help out at home. At first, police treated the cases like isolated events, but that changed on May 5, 1991, when a boy named Ailton Fonseca, just 10 years old, went missing. He was found 46 days later. His body was badly decomposed and then vanished again. I know, that sounds impossible, but according to case overviews, Ailton's body was sent to the Legal Medical Institute in Belém, and somehow it disappeared from the morgue. No exam, no autopsy, no explanation, just gone. And then came Jordilei da Cunha. He was 13, disappeared on New Year's Day 1992. His body was found just days later, with no clothes, mutilated, and clearly tortured. There were signs of burning, puncture wounds, castration. It was brutal. And things only got worse. In April 1992, Ednaldo de Souza Teixeira, 12 years old, was found dead at the bottom of an artesian well. He had been beaten, mutilated, just like the others, pretty much the same pattern. And it kept happening, one after another, all poor and young boys, all brutally harmed in ways that no one could explain. And yet the city still hadn't fully grasped what was going on. This wasn't just a series of random crimes. Altamira was facing something deeper, and it was only the beginning. Not all of the boys who were attacked in Altamira were killed. A few of them, including Jose, Otoniel, and Waldikli, survived. But what they went through was so brutal, so unimaginable, that it didn't bring relief. It just made the horror more undeniable, and their stories changed everything. The first survivor that people heard about publicly was Jose. He was only 8 years old. According to reports, Jose had been playing outside when a man approached him and offered him a small treat, something that seemed harmless. The next time anyone saw him, Jose was stumbling near a dirt road, bleeding, disoriented and in pain. He had suffered abuse, and his body showed signs of severe injuries. He was quickly rushed to a nearby clinic, and fortunately, somehow, even after all of that, he survived. Then there was Otoniel. He was 10. Based on interviews with survivors and official records, Otoniel had been picking mangoes, just a normal day for a kid in Altamira. That's when a man approached him and knocked him unconscious using a cloth soaked in some kind of chemical, maybe chloroform or ether. He was found lying in a field, bleeding and couldn't move, and his genitals had been removed. He lived, but the damage was permanent. Now, the most well-known survivor of all was Waldickley. He was attacked in July 1990, when he was just 9 years old. Waldickley had been lured toward a tree. He might have been drugged, no one knows for sure, but when he was found, he was in shock. His body was covered in deep cuts, mutilated, just like the others. Doctors had to perform several surgeries just to keep him alive. There's a rare interview from 2022 with Waldickley. He sat down with journalist Ivan Mizanzuk on the Progetto Humanos podcast. And over the course of 2 hours, he opened up about what really happened back then.
O que você lembra daquele dia em que você foi atacado?
O que eu lembro, benzinho, um dia foi um dia que ele me abordou e me levou pro mato lá e fez o que fez, né?
Você lembra onde é que você estava, com quem que você estava?
Eu estava perto do estádio que estava eu e meu primo. Ele chegou lá, me abordou, perguntou se eu queria tirar um papagaio com ele. Eu falei que sim. Aí eu fui com ele, mas meu primo falou que não era pra mim não ir, mas eu fui. E chegando lá no local lá, ele mandou eu continuar na frente dele. E eu perguntei onde é que é, ele falou, é bem aqui perto. E de repente botou um pano, não sei o que era, no meu rosto, um cheiro bem forte, e daí eu desmaiei.
Você não lembra de nada, você apagou?
Apaguei.
O que aconteceu quando você acordou? Você tem noção de quanto tempo que passou?
Não, e tanto tempo quanto eu passei lá, não tenho noção não. Sei que eu me acordei e continuei andando lá pra pista. Eu vi o barulho dos carros passando e eu, mas é pra cá a pista. Aí eu segui andando e cheguei num certo lugar lá e tinha uma mulher estendendo roupa no varal. E eu parei lá e pedi ajuda pra eu levar pro hospital.
Você tinha quantos anos?
9.
In one of his first statements to police, he even gave a basic description of the man who hurt him. But now, years later, he says a lot of what he told investigators, and even the jury, wasn't exactly true. He wasn't tortured or anything like that, but he was a kid. And according to him, he was coached, pretty much trained by a lawyer to say certain things. Things that, looking back, he says weren't real. Not because he made them up, but because when you're that young and stuck in something way bigger than you, that's what ends up happening. If you want to hear it straight from him, I'll leave the link to the full episode down below. Now, you'd think someone speaking out like this would have changed how the investigation was handled, that survivors would finally be taken seriously. But that's not what happened. Instead, their stories were treated with a mix of carelessness and inconsistency. Some police reports went missing. Some were never even filed. And the boys, most of them poor, black, and living on the edge of the city, never got any kind of psychological support. Their families were left to deal with everything on their own. The fear, the shame, the silence, all without answers. But for those who were paying attention, one thing was starting to become obvious. These weren't random attacks. They didn't happen out of nowhere. And they weren't just impulsive acts. They were planned, intentional, and they followed a script. Altamira, already dealing with poverty, land disputes, and years of government neglect, was now caught in something even darker. A pattern was forming. So, by 1992, things in Altamira had gotten completely out of control. There were just too many bodies showing up, too many kids disappearing, and now, even survivors. But somehow, no one had been arrested. No solid leads, no follow-ups that made any sense. And every official explanation felt more confusing than the last. You know, people were scared. Not because they knew what was happening, but because no one did. There were no answers, no closure. Just silence and fear. And when that happens, rumors start to grow. Some people said the boys had been victims of sexual predators. Others whispered about organ trafficking, pointing to how precise the mutilations were. There was even a police report suggesting the organs might have been taken for transplants. But that idea didn't last long once the medical examiners said the organs were either missing or too damaged to ever be used. Now that's when a new theory came up, and this one would change everything. Ritualistic murder. Police started thinking maybe these crimes weren't random at all. Like, what if they were all connected? Part of something organized, maybe a sect, a secret group with its own twisted beliefs, its own symbols, its own purpose. And that theory started to gain strength after the arrest of a homeless man named Rotilio de Souza back in 1990. He was found near one of the crime scenes, and under pressure, he confessed. But his story was all over the place, vague, inconsistent. It didn't add up. Then, he died in prison, and not long after that, the killings kept happening. So, yeah, it became pretty clear the real people behind this were still out there, and probably way more organized than anyone thought. Now, in 1993, things took a huge turn. The civil police of Pará arrested a respected psychiatrist in Altamira, Dr. Anicio Ferreira de Souza, and soon after, they went after another man, Dr. Césio Brandão, a local surgeon. Police claimed that the precision of the mutilations and the testimonies they'd gathered pointed straight to people with medical training. One witness, a guy named Edmilson da Silva Frazão, said he'd seen boys being taken by men in cars, and that those men were linked to both doctors. Later on, he said he'd also heard about a woman from outside the region, someone who preached strange ideas, talked about light, purification, higher beings, stuff that sounded spiritual but unsettling. And that was the moment the whole investigation really shifted, like it officially became about rituals. From there, a story started to take shape. The murders, people began saying, were part of ritual sacrifices, ordered or inspired by a sect that believed in child purification. And when the media got wind of that, things exploded. Protests filled the streets, parents demanded justice, and the public, they wanted names. Then, investigators started comparing things said in those testimonies with writings they found from a group most people had never even heard of, Lineamento Universal Superior. And the person behind that group? Yeah, her again. Valentina de Andrade. As the Altamira investigation started to heat up, the prosecutors and the civil police began digging deeper, not just into the crimes themselves, but into what they might actually mean. The mutilations, the strange details, the way everything seemed so deliberate. It all started to point towards something bigger, something that felt spiritual. Or at least that's what it looked like. At this point, they weren't just chasing a killer anymore. They were trying to understand a belief system, an ideology, maybe even a sect. The investigation started focusing on the idea that there was some kind of ritual or symbolic reason behind these murders. One of the key witnesses, Edmilson da Silva Frazão, gave a statement that changed the direction of the whole case. He said that back in 1991, he saw people involved in what he described as a ritual cult, and mentioned Valentina de Andrade, a name that would soon become central to everything. According to him, she was connected to gatherings where boys were somehow involved. That testimony was huge because it helped connect what was happening in Altamira to suspicions from other parts of the country, especially the south, where her name had already come up before. So, by December of 2003, more than 10 years after the first boys were found in Altamira, the woman at the center of it all, the one many had come to see as the face of the so-called sect theory, Valentina de Andrade, finally stood before a jury. She was 72 years old, and she was being charged with what they called intellectual authorship. Not for physically hurting anyone, but for supposedly inspiring or encouraging the crimes through the teachings of her spiritual group, the Lineamento Universal Superior, or LUS. Now, the prosecution had built their case on a complicated web of indirect connections: testimonies, letters, tapes, and ideas. They brought in witnesses like Edmilson de Silva Frazao, who had mentioned Valentina's name and the LUS philosophy in connection with what he described as ritual practices. They showed the jury recordings, written notes, and even some of Valentina's own spiritual writings, where she described children as emotional and unconscious instruments. There were also passages from the group's philosophy, claiming that children stood in the way of cosmic evolution. And then came the video, one shown in court, where an LUS member could be heard saying that children are violent and need to be re-educated. The prosecution's argument was simple, but honestly, it was chilling. They said these weren't just ideas. They were a green light, a kind of permission slip for violence. But Valentina's defense pushed back hard. They brought in travel records, documents, even people who knew her personally, to show that she hadn't been anywhere near Altamira when the murders happened. One report from Parana's civil police backed that up, and they pointed out that none of the evidence, not one piece, tied her physically to the victims or to any of the men who'd actually been accused of carrying out the killings. So, her lawyers argued that this was all hysteria, that the state needed someone to blame, and that Valentina became an easy target, not because of what she did, but because of what she believed. They said she was being punished for her faith, for her position as a woman leading a spiritual movement, something that didn't sit well in a system dominated by men. The trial went on for 17 days. And on the final day, after hours of waiting, the jury came back with their verdict. Not guilty. The courtroom just exploded. Some people started crying, others were yelling. Valentina collapsed in her seat, a mix of relief, exhaustion, maybe even fear. And just like that, she was free. She would never be charged again. But while the verdict closed Valentina's chapter in court, it didn't bring closure for anyone else. 4 other defendants had already been convicted in Altamira. Their sentences ranged from 35 to 77 years in prison. Among them were 2 doctors, Dr. Cesio Caldas Brandão, sentenced to 56 years, and Dr. Anísio Ferreira de Souza, sentenced to 76. But not long after the trial, the cracks started to show. Some of the convicted defendants, including the doctors and another man named Amailton Madeira Gomes, were declared fugitives. The justice system couldn't even keep track of them while appeals were being processed. The whole thing started to feel like chaos. Their lawyers kept appealing, pointing out major flaws in the case: unreliable witnesses, lack of scientific evidence, bias from judges. And in the following years, the court in Pará started accepting review petitions, debating whether parts of the trial should be annulled. What followed was years of uncertainty, and for the families of the victims, that was devastating. Justice kept feeling close and then slipping away again. It was promised, delayed, and then gone. And in that vacuum of truth, the myth of the sect only grew stronger. People started asking themselves, had it all been made up? Was this just a moral panic born out of grief and confusion? Or had the system simply failed to prove what it already knew? Either way, Altamira eventually faded from the headlines. The story went quiet. The victims became memories. But while the country debated whether it had all been real or imagined, something else was happening, somewhere else. Because in another part of Brazil, in the small towns of Maranhao, children had started disappearing again. More than 20 of them would vanish or be found mutilated in the years that followed. And this time, there was no sect, no doctrine, no philosophy behind it, just one man. By the time Brazil was caught up in the chaos of sects and theories in Altamira, something else had already been happening. Quietly, far from the headlines, up north in the state of Maranhao. And the truth is, no one was paying attention. The towns were too small, the families too poor, and the system, it just didn't care enough to notice. From 1991 all the way to 2003, in little towns like São José de Ribamar, Passo do Lumiar, São Luís, and a bunch of other places scattered across Maranhao, boys kept disappearing, one after another, under circumstances that, later on, would look disturbingly similar to what had been happening in Altamira. Most of them were young, poor, from families just trying to survive. And most of them were never found alive. And according to a 2004 federal police report, the pattern matched Altamira almost perfectly. The boys went missing. Their bodies, if they turned up at all, showed signs of extreme violence, mutilation, and attempts to cover it up. But the thing is, in Maranhao, there were no ritual theories, no sect stories, no big investigations like before. There was no media attention, no pressure, no televised trials. Just silence. Parents were told their kids had probably run away. The police barely filed reports, and when they did, no one followed up. Witnesses were ignored, and in some cases, local authorities didn't even register the disappearances as crimes. And so, year after year, boys kept vanishing. Some were found, others weren't. But the pattern, which seems so obvious now, went completely unnoticed. It was right there, in front of everyone, and somehow no one saw it. Now, it wasn't until 2003, more than 10 years later, that one single mistake forced the police to finally open their eyes. That mistake was the death of a boy named Jonathan Vieira, and the man who killed him, he wasn't part of any sect. He wasn't following some ideology or ritual. He was just one man